Let's turn to Josef Gregory Mahoney for insight on Yellen's trip. He's a politics and international relations professor at East China Normal University in Shanghai. Joseph, thanks for joining us. How successful was this visit? Because Yellen wrapped things up by saying it's undeniable that the U.S.-China relationship is on a stronger footing today than it was at this time last year. It's true, of course, but relations were pretty terrible at this time last year, right? So how is Beijing viewing things?
Well, indeed, things were terrible last year. We had all that alleged spy balloon nonsense, which was later proven to be a falsehood that was used to further imperil and undermine ties. So compared to that, certainly things have improved. And certainly, I think there were a lot of positives that came out of her visit, certainly a lot of cultural appreciation, a lot of person-to-person exchanges, a lot of recognition of some of the good work that Chinese leaders have done. Meeting old acquaintances, all of these things really embodying the sort of exchanges that Beijing promotes as being necessary for improving ties. That said, there was, of course, I think, this sort of wolf in sheep's clothing approach where, she hammered this issue of overcapacity, which, as the Chinese side, they should be a little more objective and market-oriented when they think about this problem, because a lot of studies have actually shown that overcapacity doesn't really apply to the industries that the United States is trying to restrict in China or protect against. Rather, it applies to the older, cheaper, mass-produced things like bobbleheads that the U.S. doesn't really worry about at all. So I'm a little concerned that she came here, like she went to Africa last year, where she was sowing fear against alleged debt traps, which again have been proven to be falsehoods, in order to dissuade African countries from participating in Chinese projects like the Belt Road Initiative. I think she came here to sow fear in China's economic recovery, to sow fear in Chinese confidence in its own economy. And I think that's part of the American strategic objective. What's interesting is that China, I think, had a muted response. I think they said, we'll try to work with you. I think China is mindful that this is a difficult election year, and that these years have always been, have always plagued U.S.-China relations going back to Reagan, at least in my memory. So I think China is trying to emphasize the positives, but I think on the whole, her message was one of negatives.
We know what the Biden administration message is from Yellen, but what's the message from China aimed back at the Biden administration and Yellen during these meetings in Guangzhou and Beijing? What do you think her takeaway is when she meets with the President of the United States to talk about this trip?
Well, I think the initial starting point here is the phone call that we saw between President Xi and Biden before Xi came to China, where he reminded Biden of their mutual commitment to improving ties, which they made on the sidelines of APEC in San Francisco late last year, while President Xi also acknowledged that the Biden administration has continued in many respects to provoke and undermine relations contrary to that commitment. And while, again, we see this standing offer from Beijing to talk in constructive ways to try to improve ties, I think what we were hearing from Yellen are hints that there are more tariffs and more protectionism to come, that this is almost inevitable. And this fits the general trend that has been in place, not just during the Biden administration, but throughout the Trump administration, and some would argue had its roots in the late Obama administration.
You mentioned the phone call, and you also mentioned Xi and Biden meeting in the San Francisco Bay Area in November. And now we have the Yellen visit. Does this indicate to you that there's an urgency to improve economic relations between these two economic superpowers?
I think that China would certainly love to see an improvement in relations. And I think that in many respects, American consumers have paid a substantial price for U.S. tariffs and protectionism. And certainly the green economy has paid a tremendous price by preventing essential products like solar panels and EVs from reaching a broader market. And of course, that has direct implications for climate change, which threatens all of us. That said, I think it's clear that the U.S. has committed itself to some form of tech decoupling, and perhaps is even committed to a broader strategic objective of trying to limit China's technological development, to restrict Chinese modernization, as President Xi has suggested, and perhaps even trying to push China into the middle income trap, as some argue the U.S. did to Japan in the 1980s. So I think that's the general trend, and China just has to resolve to work with the U.S. when it can, to improve ties when it can, but be prepared to build positive relations with others and go its own way when necessary.
Joseph, one final question before I let you go. You brought up, we've heard so much about the decoupling, de-risking, but there was also talk of dialogue, and Yellen acknowledged that the two economies are deeply integrated, and she said they've agreed to extensive exchanges, of course, on a lower level, but what do you imagine that could lead to?
Well, I don't know what it could lead to, because I think that the general trend is to move in a negative direction. Now, it could be that that this is election year posturing, that these are superficial conversations that are pandering to American public sentiment in search of votes that Biden needs for re-election. And it could be that, okay, Beijing will play along and we'll talk about these things, and perhaps we'll find some way to resolve them once these tensions disappear. That said, at the same time, Yellen was formerly the head of the Federal Reserve. She was chairman of the Federal Reserve. She understands very well that not only that China and U.S. have very profoundly linked economies, but that China plays a substantial role in supporting the dollar as the supranational currency. And if at some point China moves in a direction that accommodates U.S. decoupling fantasies, then this would be very detrimental to the U.S. economy as a whole, which depends substantially on the power of the dollar. So there are these deep linkages. There are also some of these superficial conversations. How all these balance out in the end remains to be seen.
Well, we'll be watching. Joseph, thanks so much for your insights.